have conducted the web-based support group. And from that, family members, patients have raised useful questions that I'd really like to address tonight. And I'd like to help provide a perspective on why a person behaves a certain way that may make it easier to deal with it and to understand it and to not get so upset about it. So without further ado, here we go. So the title is The Road Ahead, How Dementing Disorders Progress and What to Do About It. So I don't know if I used to go to Norway every year. And in Oslo, there's a park called Grønner Park, and the sculptor Wieland created an incredible sculpture garden called the Tree of Life. And you walk along the bridge and you see from the beginning the birth of a child, and then as you walk down the bridge, the trees each have somebody a little bit older until you get at the end of the bridge and you have a person at the end of life. And I think that we can choose, to a large extent, we can choose where we want to go. Do we want to proceed from birth to dependence or to having wisdom, the wisdom of aging and experience? Dementia and decline are not inevitable. It's been well established that they are not aging. They are a disease process. So where is my loved one heading, and where is their dementia heading? Well, this is where I think it's really useful to understand the causes of behavior, because they are frequently misinterpreted to the detriment of the spouse, the family, and the patient. We often interpret our loved one's behavior as intentional. They were trying to do it on purpose. However, the effect of a brain disease causes the brain to malfunction. And what is the function of the brain? It's behavior. So the change in a loved one's behavior is more likely to be a system malfunction, leading to the biological inability to perform a given brain function. And if that's true, the following should be true as well. If the cause of the change in behavior is due to a disease, due to the pathology of a dementing disorder, then the changes should be very predictable if the progression of the pathology is predictable. And in fact, Barry Reesberg showed that the changes in behavior due to Alzheimer's, as well as most other dementias, are extremely predictable. He did a 30-year longitudinal study of approximately 3,000 individuals over their life. And from that, he developed an incredibly powerful tool, the FAST staging instrument, that helps us understand many things, not only what to expect and why we expect it, but more than that. This is what the instrument looks like. You may know that I've probably asked many of you questions that allow me to assign a stage of how the brain is functioning using this tool. And I do it, I try to do it religiously, because if there are certain principles about it. For example, in Alzheimer's disease, a person will progress sequentially through the stages and not skip them. So if I see that a particular stage got skipped, oops, let's say they don't have a memory problem, but they can't do well-learned skills. That's a clue that either uh, they don't have Alzheimer's and they have something else, or they may have Alzheimer's plus something else, or they may have some acute illness or a medical condition that is causing that. So it gives me a clue what to look for. And often, very often, I find that what we're seeing when we see a change is not progression of Alzheimer's. It's something that happened in a person's life or something in terms of a medical condition that got worse or an injury. There are many, many things that affect the progression. So this tool tells me a lot. You'll also see that on this tool, the fast staging, it gives the mental age in years. And I'll talk a little bit about that. So I like this pyramid idea. I stole it from the, the Aztecs, I believe. And what it shows is kind of the pyramid of life. And it has a number of different things about the fast stage. At the top, you see that the first stage is either a completely normal brain. And when this was actually studied pathologically by doctors Brack and Brack, they studied 4,000 or 5,000 brains from 30 years on to 100 years old. And what they found was that only about 1% of people had no pathology. So having pathology of Alzheimer's and tangles, plaques is very common. Initially, in Alzheimer's pathology, it actually starts in the brainstem, not anywhere else. And it doesn't really cause any symptoms. And that period lasts approximately 15 years. Typically, it starts around 45 years old, or no, I'm sorry, it starts around 30 years old, goes to 45. And at 45, memory starts to decline notably. And that occurs in aging as well. That leads to fast stage 2. And that is still on an independent living stage. People are fully independent, but because they've noticed a decline in their memory capacity, they do things to compensate for that, like take more notes, use an iPhone, a calendar, so that they can keep track of their of the things that they have to take care of in the near future. Now, that stage itself only involves a small area of the brain called the entorhinal cortex, and that is responsible for recalling details of an event, recalling things out of context, like a person's name or a phone number. These are details, and that becomes more difficult. So people talk about trouble with recalling names, recalling specific things that happened recently. That stage lasts for about 15 years. And it's also a stage, as I mentioned, of independent living. Now, that stage still corresponds to a mental capacity of an adult. But at some point, if the person has Alzheimer's and it doesn't go treated, it will progress to the third stage, fast stage 3, and you see this dark purple area. That is the hippocampus. And when the hippocampus has enough tangles, then the ability to compensate for a decline in memory fails. At that point, the spouse or someone is going to have to help the individual with keeping track of current affairs, following up on things, remembering appointments, managing complex medications. Many people, as they get older, they have a myriad of medications that's bewildering and requires probably a PhD to do properly. That stage, past stage 3, predominantly is causing dysfunction of the hippocampus. The hippocampus takes all the details of an event and wraps them together. It associates them. That's why it's called associative short-term memory. Okay. So the ability to, for example, recall that you went to a recent party, not to recall the details, just to recall that you did it. That is the associative memory of the hippocampus. And when that fails, people enter the first stage of dependence where they need assistance from others. Now, that stage, according to Reesberg's study on the equivalent developmental age of each of these stages, that stage corresponds to a teenager, 12 to 20 years old. That stage lasts approximately 3 years. The next stage, oh, by the way, that stage is, you've probably heard this term now, MCI, or mild cognitive impairment. Ron Peterson invented it. I would have to argue that there's nothing mild about it. It does impair function, but it's kind of a nice term. But it's not dementia. Dementia is not the failure of memory. Dementia is the failure of ability to perform well-learned skills. And that's the stages 5 and 6 in the pathology, where it spreads from the hippocampus to the surface of the brain called the cortex. And as it spreads further and further, one proceeds through fast stages 4 to 7. And I'll go through those as well. But just keep in mind that as one progresses through those stages, a person's going through the reversal of development. So in fast stage 4, they're an adolescent, about 8 to 12 years old. In fast stage 5, they're a child, 5 to 7 years old. In fast stage 6, they're a young child, 2 to 5 years old. And finally, in fast stage 7, their mental capacity is at the level of an infant. And I can tell you for sure, I've seen that. My mother is that way. So let's now go through these stages. This is kind of what the retrogenesis looks like. Here's the fast stages, and here's the equivalent stages of development. And they follow a beautiful reverse curve. Now you're going to see on every slide, you're going to see at the top this train of arrows, and each box is a different fast stage. In it tells you the number of years in that stage, and then during independence, I haven't said anything cumulatively about it, but once dependence begins, I'm going to sum up the total number of years that a person is dependent, because what we can do with treatment is we can extend the years of independence a great deal, and it's getting better and better and better. So one is spending less and less time dependent upon others by taking a proactive approach, detecting it literally while there are no symptoms, and that's very easy to do now. And then getting the proper diagnosis of the cause and having it treated. And there's very few things that aren't treatable in terms of the degenerative brain diseases. That's contrary to what many super experts will tell you. But I've done this for 37 years, and I've seen by measuring that things do in fact make a difference, a huge difference sometimes. So in this stage, fast stage two, uh, I commonly hear things like, oh, he's more irritable. He seems depressed, and, he doesn't want to engage. Uh, and the behavior is essentially withdrawal. Well, biologically, memory is declining and they're compensating. They're still independent, but it does take more effort. It takes more effort. At the end of the day, you're more tired. Maybe you're a little frustrated and your confidence is not as high. So you can imagine the impact of that on going out and interacting with others. You would tend to withdraw. So, but what the caregiver, the spouse sees is irritability and depression. Now, here's the fast stage three, mild cognitive impairment, capacity of about a teenager. And what I hear commonly during this stage is, well, sometimes he forgets within seconds or minutes. Also, I hear he lies. He never used to lie, but he lies. And he makes things up that never happened. Well, that's the interpretation of intentionality. But biologically, what's happening is that with the further decline in memory and the failure of compensation, what's going on in the brain when they talk about lying, making things up that never happened, is that whenever you retrieve a memory, okay, that activates a certain set of networks in the brain and to generate the memory. But, there are many memories that share the same networks. So not only do you have to retrieve a specific memory, but you have to block or inhibit other memories that share those networks from being retrieved. And if you don't inhibit or block those other memories, they come out too. So what happens is you get a mixture of memories. And that's where the false memories, the mixed memories, what sounds like lying, things that never occurred, that's where all that's coming from. It's not intentional. Past stage four, now we're looking at a person with a mental capacity of about 8 to 12 years old. And this is the first stage of dementia. It's called mild dementia. I don't take credit for those adjectives. And what I will commonly hear from families is that he doesn't want to do anything anymore. He's lazy, doesn't help out at home. I can't get him to do anything but watch TV. So there's an intentionality there, kind of a negativity. Well, what's going on in the brain is that now the pathology has spread to the cortex. The surface of the brain has 110 billion neurons. It has 1,000 trillion connections, okay? They have to work together to perform the well-learned activities of life. And the more complex the activity, the more brain regions get involved, the more neurons, the more networks, the more synapses get involved. So initially, the most well-learned skills become affected. It might be a hobby, it might be driving, it might be knowing how to use a complicated computer program, but it had to have been well learned, something that a person's done for decades. And in order to do any task, there are three basic steps. First, the brain has to initiate the task, initiate the activity required to perform it. Second, they have to be able to perform the task in the correct sequence of steps that are involved in performing a task. I remember when I directed a skilled nursing facility for a while, and the physical therapist, I had them write out the number of steps to brush your teeth. Turns out there are 17 steps, and any of them going wrong, you stop brushing your teeth. So, and finally, you have to be able to concentrate long enough to finish the task. And if any of those steps fail, then persons can't do the task. This is what we call apraxia, the loss of the ability to perform well-learned skills. And again, this is biological. This is not intentional. Past stage 5 is is considered to be a moderate dementia, and it predominantly affects judgment, social behavior, and the ability to monitor one's own abilities. It typically lasts about 1.5, 2 years, and the developmental age of the individual is 5 to 7 years old. Now, what we see in the brain is that the pathology, the tangles, the plaques have spread further, and they start to spread into the frontal lobe. And what I hear from families is, oh, he's in denial. He doesn't think he has a memory problem. He thinks his memory's fine. He's crazy. Okay. He doesn't care about his appearance anymore. He wears dirty clothes. He's very inappropriate socially sometimes, says whatever's on his mind. There's no filter at all. And then sometimes it's pretty bad. He doesn't care where he pees anymore. And, he'll pick up his poo out of the toilet. I mean, it's real disinhibited behavior. Well, what's going on in the brain? Well, portions of the frontal lobe are responsible for monitoring your own abilities. And if that area is damaged, then people can no longer monitor their own abilities, like their memory ability. So just for example, let's say a person, that area was damaged 3 years ago, and whatever their memory ability was 3 years ago, that was the last time it got recorded by the monitoring system. So from then on, what they will perceive in terms of their judgment of their memory is what it was like 3 years ago, not what it's like now. And you can, present it to them, show it right to their face. And, they might say, well, it's just, I'm tired. We come up with all sorts of reasons, but they literally do not perceive the difficulty. And the Alzheimer's Association, you hear denial, denial, denial. Well, you really can't deny what you don't know. And if you stop recording how you are, you don't know. Now, also, the frontal lobes are your social brakes. They keep you from saying or doing what you think when it isn't appropriate. I mean, we all have thoughts that we don't express. We all have behaviors that we don't express, even though we think them. And that's the frontal lobe that inhibits inappropriate thoughts from being expressed. It inhibits inappropriate behaviors. When those areas are damaged, then you get social disinhibition. People say exactly what's on their mind. I just heard about, a lady who is very, very appropriate, very well-mannered. Now if there's anything that goes wrong in the restaurant with her dinner, she lets the cooks know, she lets the waiters know. That's what's going on in stage 5. Again, this is not intentional. This is the biology. Stage 6, that's considered a moderately severe dementia. The developmental age at that point is 2 to 5 years old. And it is characterized by a further progression of the so-called apraxia, the skills of life. And it's no longer complex skills. Now we're talking about personal, basic activities of daily living, um, dressing, bathing, toileting, in a sense, knowing not only how to do those things, but when to do them and where. That's why you see people maybe going to the bathroom in the bushes or on houseplants. They've lost the ability to know where you perform that activity. And the family will say, he wants me to do everything now for him. He refused to even help putting his clothes on. He could do it if he wants to, though. Well, what is that? That they can do it sometimes and they can't do it others. Well, that could be interpreted as if he wants to, he can. Well, the biological interpretation is that under certain circumstances, particularly family gatherings, it literally raises the activity of the brain, stimulates the brain so that all people can perform at a higher level. And it may be high enough so they can do things that they normally fail to do. That's very, very common. So again, this is not intentional. It is a biological fact. The final stage is 7. The developmental age is 1 to 2 years old, an infant. And at that point, it's not so much a problem with interpreting behavior. Now there's kind of concerns about, well, how long does he have? How long do I have? What can I expect? What's his prognosis? Should I stop his medication? Should I consider assisted suicide? It's a horrible life. He's having a horrible life. That may not necessarily be what the patient perceives, but it's certainly sometimes what the caregiver perceives and the spouse perceives. I have direct experience with that with my mother. She's as happy as a clam a lot of the time, and sometimes she's a mean lady. So, but she's like a kid. She's like an infant. They're up and down all the time. Here we have biologically a loss of midline functions of the body, and these are areas in the middle of the brain. They include areas below the cortex, the basal ganglia, which performs very repetitive movements, the input to the brain called the thalamus, the autonomic nervous system in the hypothalamus, which basically sends out signals to every organ in your body. And there is a nervous system in every organ in your body, and it helps the organ function properly. And it receives signals from the hypothalamus of the brain to allow all the organs to work together like a symphony. And that's when your function is really good. But when the autonomic system starts to fail, what you see are things like changes in salivation, either dry mouth or drooling or alternating, changes in sweating, too dry, too sweaty, constipation, diarrhea, they can alternate. Temperature sensitivity, you hear that all the time, too cold or too hot. Blood pressure control, sometimes they have high pressure, sometimes they have low pressure, sometimes they almost pass out because their autonomic nervous system can't adjust to changes in position quickly enough, so the blood rushes out of their head and they get lightheaded. Thirst control, sometimes, most of the time what you see is dehydration, but also you can have overhydration where they drink too much and that causes a dilution of sodium, and that is havoc for the brain because the brain uses sodium to generate all the signals that conduct the activity of the brain. So in this stage, the vital functions are lost. And so if we look at the total course of the dependency stage, if you don't treat, it's approximately 12 to 16 years. Now, that is not inevitable. So what can we do? Well, this is kind of a laundry list of the things that I think about when treating people. It's now pretty widely accepted that a multi-domain intervention is the most effective. It includes things like lifestyle involving diet, active exercise, mental stimulation, and and good medical management of your existing problems. And there are many international studies now that show there's an enormous effect of that if one complies with the lifestyle recommendations. We had a study with a coach, a life coach on one treatment arm. The other treatment arm got the same recommendations without the coach, and the group with the coach, they complied better and they showed no decline. The majority of them showed no decline over a 2-year period. So lifestyle has a big effect. In fact, when you measure the effect and compare it to the recently approved drugs for Alzheimer's, the lifestyle effect is actually larger if you comply. Now, another thing that helps maintain function is keeping a regular routine with little variation. And the reason for that is that we can perform functions better when there's a cognitive problem if there's no variability. If there's variability, then that's going to require more memory. And if the memory's not working, then things fail if things vary. So that's one of the reasons that, if a person goes on a trip, normally they might have really enjoyed it, but a lot of times they get very disoriented, very scared. Deviations from routine are scary. That often leads to not wanting to leave the house. So we actually published a study on procedural learning where we took people severely demented. They couldn't even say their names. And we had them try a fine motor skill and a gross motor skill where they tossed a beanbag towards a target and to see if they would improve their accuracy. And we also had them track the movement of a record with a stylus. And in both activities, these severely demented people learned, but they only learned if the practice was exactly the same each time. If you vary the practice, they never learned, okay? So there are other learning systems called procedural memory that allow even severely demented people to learn procedures. We've talked a little bit about managing existing medical conditions, and the reason is that if a medical condition is not managed, it produces damage to cells, and that stresses the cells. They have to make new proteins, replace the damaged ones, and if the capacity of the cell is outstripped by the damage, that's when errors in protein production and folding occur, and that's when you start to see the misfolded proteins aggregate, and over time, you see the development and progression of degenerative disease, and that's true for body and brain. So managing existing medical conditions reduces the total amount of stress upon the body that occurs and is a major reason for progression. Fourth, treatment, remove the disease. I kiddingly say Dr. Shankle, but you can see these are a laundry list of some of the treatments that by measuring an amount of disease uh, and function have learned that these things really work, and they work better in combination. I'm not going to go through the details here, but many of you are aware of these, and there's strong scientific evidence, and I test it out in every patient to see if it's really working in that patient in order to continue it. So I think that, again, there's a wide perception that there's no effective treatment. And going back to when I started in 1988, I looked back while making this talk, and I realized that there were periods where there was real improvement in treatment effect. In other words, the ability to prolong independence and the ability to delay the decline during dependent stages is real. And I realized that there are several periods of time. Initially, there was no treatment. And then Aricept came along, but Aricept doesn't work at all. That was about 1988 to 1997. And that is what I call the untreated course of Alzheimer's. Then memantine and ribostigmine were introduced, as well as galantamine. And several studies show that the progression of Alzheimer's is delayed by anywhere from 50% to 67%, half to two-thirds, for as long as you take it. Also, those drugs, they improve memory and cognitive abilities for about 2 to 3 years. So that's not trivial. The next thing that happened were identifying research that showed that certain supplements actually remove these misfolded proteins. And from 2010 to 2015, I introduced those, and I started to see that people were staying in the fast stages much longer and weren't progressing as quickly. From 2015 to 2025, I had been using intravenous IgG prior to that. These are antibodies that are commercially available, but discovered from a study of rats that inhaled through the nose the same antibodies, that it was far more effective in getting into the brain, somewhere between 30 and 1,700 times better than when it's injected into the blood vessel and given intravenously. Furthermore, by inhaling it through the nose, it doesn't go into the blood, it goes directly into the brain, and it doesn't cause the hemorrhages that the antibodies that have been approved by the FDA cause. The most recent one, Kisunla, the hemorrhage rate is 25%, and they call that an improvement. And then the most recent finding is kind of surprising to me. It was something called Percepta. It's made out of the cat's claw plant combined with oolong tea extract. A very prominent neuroscientist discovered that, and he was sort of a chemical genius. And it actually is a plant in the Amazon jungle. And when combined with a potent antioxidant, it really unzips these misfolded proteins and gets rid of them. I'm really surprised. I've seen probably about 500 patients, and you can almost predict with certainty that within 3 to 9 months, some cognitive ability is going to improve. So to summarize these impacts in the treatment of Alzheimer's, think about it in terms of how many more years of independence could I have? And with the no treatment approach, that's the green progression through the fast stages. That's if you were to take 100-year life, there would be 60 years of independence. If you add in memantine and ribostigmine, that's the progression of the blue. And you can see that they don't go all the way down as far as the untreated course. And that the years of independence is about 65 out of 100. If you then throw in the supplements that actually remove pathology, that's the yellow stages. Now you can see it's prolonged in each stage. And that leads to about a 70 out of 100 years of independence. Then when we added intranasal antibodies, that was probably the most potent effect I've ever seen. That's the pink region. So much longer, if you get people started in stage 2, they stay independent for a long, long time, about 80 out of 100 years. And I've been wanting to take the next step and characterize each person's antibodies that target the misfolded proteins in their brain, because that has the potential to remove 20 to 100 times as much disease as the intranasal IgG antibodies. And that's not just for Alzheimer's, that's for basically any degenerative brain disease. We've been having trouble getting access to funds. We're still trying. Now, we actually started a nonprofit 501c3 so we could raise the money to do the first phase of this study. And I'm very excited about it. We'll be talking a little bit more about it in the next webinar. So what is it like to actually, what's the experience like for Alzheimer's disease? And I'm going to present something to you I did about 25 years ago with a couple of other scientists. And it was a study of painters. And we did a computerized mathematical analysis of their actual paintings. And we found that each painter has a characteristic mathematical signature that never changes throughout their life, regardless of changes in the style of their paintings. And a great example is Willem de Kooning. He was a representational artist, studied in the Dutch School of the Masters, and then he evolved to become a very abstract artist. And then finally, in 1980, Jeff Cummings at UCLA diagnosed him with Alzheimer's disease. And here's the big surprise. So he's another good example because he continued to paint, his favorite activity, throughout his life, even while he had Alzheimer's disease. It wasn't as detailed, but he was still doing what he loved. So he could continue to maintain that behavior. So here's in 1921, here's a good example of one of his representational drawings. And beneath each of these drawings, you're going to see these graphs. I won't go into detail what they actually mean, but mathematically, they characterize the amount of detail where the painter is focusing their efforts in detail. And you can see these little spikes for de Kooning, and those spikes are an increase in the detail at about a 2 hertz spatial frequency. I always have trouble understanding that, but don't worry about it. The basic idea is that there is a characteristic signature for de Kooning. Now notice these pink graphs, they're missing it. Why? Well, you'll see. But notice also how abstract his paintings have become. Now, further on, 1970s, 1980s, finally 1987, you can see simpler, still very abstract. And if you look at his curves, if you compared 1970 paintings to 1971, that spike of activity is gone. If you compare 1921 to 1984, when he was diagnosed with Alzheimer's, the spike is gone. If you compare 1954 to 1986, the spike is gone. And notice that this signature, mathematical signature, disappeared in 1970, 10 years before he was diagnosed with Alzheimer's. I think that is amazing. It says something that the artist in drawing is projecting something that is a projection of their brain's activity. And isn't that exciting? So to end, I like to say that science is the art of discovering less incorrect truth from less incorrect data. And I think that's what I've learned over the course of my career as a scientist and a doctor. And thank you for putting up with me. I'll stop here.
Well, thank you very much, Doc. That was a very informative lecture. We have a couple questions that have come in already. The first one is about Lewy body dementia, which I know we didn't discuss too much in this talk. It's very specific and is curious if you know about any of the drugs that are currently in phase 2 trials, and if you have a sense of which ones might be most promising, or when you think the first drug could be approved for Lewy body dementia. Are there any that are in phase 3 trials? And then I think just more generally, to help shape this question, how does the fast staging apply to Lewy body dementia or any of the other neurodegenerative conditions that,
Okay. First of all the drugs for Lewy body disease are focusing on a misfolded protein that's very common with Lewy body disease. It's called alpha-synuclein. And alpha-synuclein is a protein that is found in synapses, the connections of neurons. Each neuron has 20,000 synapses, so it communicates with approximately 20,000 other neurons. And those synapses contain alpha-synuclein, which performs a normal function, but for some reason, it becomes damaged and starts to misfold in a variety of conditions, not just Lewy body, but also Parkinson's disease, multisystem atrophy, and a few others that are rarer. So in order to treat Lewy body, you want to remove this misfolded protein. And so the drugs are focusing on that. Now, here's the problem. And I don't know how many people agree with me on this, but if you, as a result of measuring these misfolded proteins in the spinal fluid, what I've learned is people don't fit into these siloed diagnostic categories. They have a little bit of Alzheimer's, they have some Lewy body, they have some vascular disease. It's not uncommon, not uncommon at all. In fact, when I looked at it, the data, I found that around 75% of people diagnosed who met the biomarker criteria for Alzheimer's also had a second disease, second brain degenerative disease, often Lewy body, sometimes others. So here's the problem with the drug. Again, I'm criticizing the drug companies, but they do their best. But with the mindset that you're treating a single disease, they're focusing on the pathology of that disease and leaving the other diseases that the person has in their brain untreated. So this is one possible reason that many of the drugs for Alzheimer's have failed. They only remove amyloid. They don't remove neurofibrillary tau. They don't remove alpha-synuclein, which is frequently coexisting. Okay. So as long as we kind of treat these silos of disease, we're never going to treat the complete disease in most patients. And that's what excites me about Dr. Charlie Glabe's work at UCI. He did a very simple experiment where he took a milliliter of blood from people, and he found he was able to characterize all the different types of antibodies that their immune system makes. And then he was able to identify which of those antibodies are targeting misfolded proteins in the brain. So he can literally create a characteristic signature of a person's disease at each person's level. And once you do that, then you identify, okay, which antibodies are most effective at removing all these different pathological species in a given patient. And now I think the power of that is going to result in a revolution in treating degenerative brain disease. Now, I think I've forgotten something that Christopher asked me.
Yeah, just if there are any new drugs or any, when do you think the first drug for Lewy body will be approved?
Well, let me put it this way. In people who have been treated with intranasal IgG antibodies, these are derived from thousands and thousands of blood donors. So they're mixtures of all these antibodies that thousands of donors have. And so they're getting some percentage of antibodies that are targeting Lewy body, Alzheimer's, and all the other common degenerative brain diseases. Okay. And I've seen sometimes almost miraculous results. We have a number of people with Parkinson's disease who had things like shuffling, drooling, soft voice, difficulty getting out of a chair, etc. And after a year of intranasal IgG antibodies, the only thing left is a tremor in their lip. Now, that was 5 years ago, and they are still at that level. They have not progressed. For some reason, the antibodies present in these pooled donors were the right ones for this individual, and it was miraculous. And I've seen that not all the time, but a significant enough percentage of the time so that I became aware of it. And I've also seen that most patients with Lewy body, most patients with Parkinson's do show improvement. They do show stability. It may not be as grand as what I just described, but it's real. And so if you ask, when are the first treatments going to become available? They already are. Okay. But it will be a great contribution to identify things that remove alpha-synuclein. One thing, by the way, that removes alpha-synuclein is green tea extract. At a dose of 9 milligrams per kilogram body weight, they did an experiment in Down syndrome and showed that in Down syndrome, attention and concentration improved, but more importantly, it helped remove both alpha-synuclein and the beta amyloid of Alzheimer's disease. I'm looking for other things that also remove alpha-synuclein. One possibility, I haven't seen as clear a data on this, but it's a very real possibility that the cat's claw plant will remove alpha-synuclein. And now that we have ability to measure alpha-synuclein, we'll be able to determine which agents that are not necessarily $25,000 a year will actually remove these misfolded proteins. And we can actually measure it. If we can't measure it, we can't treat it. That's what I don't understand. You've got to be able to measure a disease to treat it. Because if you give something, how are you going to tell if it works?
Well, thanks for that answer, Doc. I have a couple more questions. I know we're kind of running down the hour. Let's see. One of them is asking how to access intranasal IgG as a treatment. Do you have any advice on that?
Um, well, if you're a patient in the Shankle clinic, I make that available to anyone who is interested in it. So that's one way. I recently learned, I've been doing it for about 10 years, probably have treated over 400 people. So far, no brain hemorrhages in that long, as opposed to 25% brain hemorrhages with the Alzheimer drugs coming out. I recently learned that there is a doctor in Florida who's contacting me. He wants to contact me, and he's starting to use intranasal IgG. I found out there's another doctor in Arizona who wants to meet with me and learn the protocol. So there's a very few doctors that do it, but it's now starting to get recognized.
I will also just add that, one thing that Dr. Shankle is working on with me is coming up with some sort of publication on his protocol for using the intranasal IgG so that hopefully more doctors will be able to follow that protocol soon. So Doc, we have a lot of questions. I don't know if you want to stay late and answer them or how you feel, but maybe we'll answer a couple more.
I would suggest I'm getting kind of tired.
Oh, you're getting tired. Okay, all right. So we'll do one more
no,
question.
hang on. I would suggest the following, that we write those questions down and plan to answer them in the next webinar.
Okay, sounds good. All right, everyone. Well, thank you so much for coming. I'm sorry if we weren't able to answer all questions, but what we will do is we'll get them answered and we'll send them around via email at the very least. But thank you so much for attending, everyone.
Thank you.
So appreciate it.
I always appreciate your listening.
Yep.
Bye-bye.
Take care, everyone.